Hey y'all, it is Nikki. Welcome back to the channel. Let's talk good guys. First things first, I do want to clarify something that I mentioned in my last video, which you can find in the description below. I think I said something that might have been a little bit confusing, and one commenter actually drew my attention to it, so thank you so much for drawing my attention to this so that I can now clarify. I was talking about how with retellings, you can sometimes get stuck and restricted by the original story. For me personally, I find that I struggle with that. I find it difficult to get as creative as I could get otherwise with just a unique story, because I always feel like, oh, I can't do this if it's not in the original, or I can't stray too far from the original. With fairy tale retellings, that's a problem because a lot of the fun of fairy tale retellings is putting your own spin on it. But I also mentioned my personal experience with sort of dabbling in like a biblical retelling and allegory, and how that also made it really hard for me in that project because I was trying to make things connect to the Bible that just didn't really connect. I really wanted it to, but the creative direction that I wanted to take was very different. So I just found that the whole allegory or retelling aspect was really, really restrictive. So like in general, with retellings, my advice would be to remember that like it's your story and you can create it however you want. You can take it in whatever direction you want to take it in. So that applies to like fairy tales and other kinds of retelling, but that does not apply to biblical retellings or allegories. I wanted to make that clear. When I was talking about my project, the conclusion I reached wasn't that like, okay, I guess I'll just do whatever I want and take this Bible story wherever I want to take it. No, don't do that. Ultimately, we have to be true to truth. What I realized for my own project was that I wasn't writing a retelling or an allegory at all. I was writing a unique story, maybe with some ties to a Bible story, but it was not strictly a retelling, and realizing that allowed me to be a lot more creative and to feel a lot more free to just write the story that I had in mind, but a story that still glorifies God. So, to recap, there are different rules for when you're writing a biblical retelling or a sort of biblical allegory, because at the end of the day, when dealing with the Holy Scriptures, we do have an obligation to be absolutely true to them because they are 100% truth. I hope that makes it a little clearer, and thank you again to the commenter who drew my attention to this. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about characters, specifically good and evil characters, and more specifically, good characters. I've been trying to get into the fairy tale zone lately to prep for NaNoWriMo and for my Peter Pan retelling. Side note, observe my research. Is it sort of counterproductive to put a sticky note on almost every single page of a book? Yes, probably, but there are just so many good lines that I don't want to miss anything, and this book is just magic from cover to cover, seriously. I've noticed that the whole good and evil binary can be a lot more explicit in fairy tales than in other kinds of story. Fairy tales tend to have that more simplistic plot structure to them. You end up with characters that are literally called the evil queen, and then characters on the flip side who are just like the embodiment of goodness, and we don't really know why they got that way, and it's not super realistic that those characters would be that way. I have no problem rolling with that usually. I love me a good fairy tale. But lately, as I've been really trying to get into this fairy tale zone, and especially dealing with retellings to try and practice the whole retelling thing, I've noticed that that whole good versus evil thing can start to feel a little bit hollow. And interestingly, the part that I tend to struggle the most with is the good guy, the good character. Honestly, whenever you remove the ultimate source of goodness from a story and then try to have characters who are just good, it can start to feel a little bit flimsy. I believe that Jesus is the only person who was ever truly good. So it's a little bit confusing and a little bit hollow sometimes when you come across these characters who are either just like innately good for some reason, which is not super relatable. I mean, I've never met anyone like that, and I personally am not that. Or on the flip side, you can end up with characters who are kind of just good because they happen to be on the right side, in which case the whole concept of goodness becomes a little bit precarious and stops meaning as much. Like if your character is only the good guy because they're not as bad as the villain, or only the good guy because they only do bad things for decent reasons, can we really call them good guys? Especially in like contemporary YA or YA fantasy, books that are written today, even based on old classic stories, I find that this is becoming more and more true because moral ambiguity is kind of in right now. People don't want, clear-cut characters. They want characters who do messy things and make mistakes. And understand that, it's relatable, but I also struggle when we have these characters that we're supposed to be cheering for, but they're doing these kind of like off-color, morally gray things, yet we're still supposed to cheer for them, till it reaches the point where every character is kind of just doing what seems perfectly right and justified to them, and then the entire story breaks down because who are we supposed to be cheering for, and why is one character better than the other? I was talking with my brother about good guys the other day, and how morally sound characters are characters that are consistently striving for sort of a higher standard of morality. They're not just magically good because they were born that way, but they have sort of a higher truth that they're aspiring to. Those characters tend to be boring. And I know that sounds bad to say, and I don't even like to say it, but it's kind of true. They're not always very interesting, and I kind of feel like it's probably fairly difficult to write a character that is consistently striving for that morality and doesn't want to make compromises, yet is still interesting. Because let's face it, the anti-hero is kind of awesome. I mean, who doesn't love a good anti-hero? They're so interesting, they're unpredictable, they bring a great magic touch to a story. I will be the first to agree with you, I love me a good anti-hero. Anti-heroes, morally great characters, are relatable in the sense that we can all connect with the idea of being flawed and making mistakes all the time because we do it all the time. But that said, I wouldn't want anti-heroes to take over all books and all stories. I don't think the only role of the story is to be a mirror of what we already know about ourselves. I think the power of the story and the more important role of the story is to point us towards something better, to point us to a higher truth, something that we can all be striving for that will make us better people for having read the book. I believe in redemption for anti-heroes. And there often is, but sometimes the anti-hero who starts morally gray kind of still ends morally gray. And I think it's important for readers to see how even that anti-hero can ascribe to that higher truth and be changed by it in a way that we can all be changed by it too. Let's bring in more good guys. Really good guys. Not good guys that were just magically born good, but heroes who believe in a higher standard, in a higher truth. Whether or not you're a Christian, without sort of a higher standard above the story, the whole good versus evil thing can fly on the surface, but when you really dig deep into it, it sort of falls apart and starts to feel a bit flimsy. So if those characters just have nothing higher that they're appealing to, no higher standard that they're striving for, even the whole idea of a good guy can start to feel sort of weak. Maybe that's part of the reason why those characters can feel a little bit boring. But I don't think they have to be boring. Let's bring in more of those good guys. Not perfect characters, but characters who are flawed and committed to goodness, committed to striving for goodness, and to striving through all of their flaws that they're still working through because we're people and we're all flawed. Bring in characters whose idea of goodness isn't just like not killing as many people as the villain or generally being friendly to people. Bring in characters who live by the golden rule, who don't want to make compromises, who don't want to make morally gray decisions, and if they do, who do everything in their power to get themselves pointing in a more morally clear direction. How about more hidden heroes instead of anti-heroes? Heroes who maybe don't look great on the surface and start off really rough around the edges, but by the end of the story become better than they were at the beginning, like we should all be striving to do. I'm passionate about this, guys. I'm not sure if you could tell, but I just really strongly believe that stories have a lot of power and that with great power comes great responsibility. If you're going to write a story, if it's just for purely entertainment purposes, I feel like there's so much more power in a story that we're not tapping into. That stories should point to the way, the truth, and the life because they should help us to be better people. They should help us to want to be better people and to make the world a better place. Good characters don't have to be characters that we can't relate to at all because, well, they were born with that goodness and I don't have that, so I'll just go hang out with the anti-heroes. No, good characters, the solid good guy is a character who is flawed but is striving for something better, who is striving to be better and committed to that. I don't think that has to be boring, and maybe that's a challenge for all of us, to write some really awesome good guys. This isn't just me like imposing my ideas on all of you. This is for myself too, because morally ambiguous characters are super fun to write. Like, come on, anti-heroes are not only super fun to read and to watch and things, but writing them is so interesting. And I believe that there is definitely a place for anti-heroes. I just think redemption should be a part of the equation, and if redemption isn't in the cards for them, then there should still be some sort of redeeming message in the story itself to show us that they might not have chosen the right path, but there still is a right path. And ultimately, I just think we do need less moral ambiguity in characters, despite whatever the market is telling us right now, and more the kind of goodness in characters that points us towards something real and true and higher than ourselves. Or someone. Just saying. Thank you so much for watching this little rant from the heart. I hope that it was at least interesting to you guys, even if you don't agree with all of it. I hope you can see where I'm coming from. It's food for thought. Feel free to like and subscribe if you feel so compelled. And I also wanted to add that if you guys have any topics that you'd like me to talk about, or anything in particular that you'd like me to make a video on, feel free to let me know because I'm always looking for ideas. And as always, do not forget to spend some time in the clouds today.